Guys, 2% times 30 million adds up to a whole bunch of who gives a shit.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Beta Kit Podcast. I'm Douglas Saltis, Editor-in-Chief of Beta Kit, and my co-host, as always, is Rob Kennedy. This year on the podcast, we've been talking to a lot of VCs. Apparently you like this. Hopefully providing you an insider's perspective on the state of the market and what they think founders are doing right and wrong. But as we noted in our interview with Mark McQueen, head of CIBC Innovation Banking, the VC perspective is just one perspective. And so far, that perspective has been pretty limited to Canada. So today, we're going to talk to a Valley-based VC. While it's a Valley-founded VC with their CEO based in Tennessee, that is also running product market and go-to-market programming for a bevy of Canadian accelerators like Propel, Technation, Collabs, Platform Calgary, and the new Alberta Innovates Revenue Accelerator. That sounds like a pretty unique perspective, right? On the podcast this week is Andrew Goldner, CEO and founding partner of GrowthX, and man, do we cover a lot of bases. The differences between the Canada and US markets, why suddenly every VC cares about revenue generation again, problems with the current accelerator model for VCs and founders, what business VCs are actually in, and whether founders should even take their money. Oh, and a hefty bunch of go-to-market tips thrown in for good measure. Andrew is a well-spoken storyteller, but he also doesn't mince his words where it counts. And it was refreshing to hear the Midwesterner bluntly say things that most Canadian VCs won't, at least not publicly or on this podcast. So prepare yourself. It's a long one. Let's dig in. All right, Andrew, we got a lot to talk about on this episode. And judging from our call earlier this week, there might be a lot more that we're going to leave on the table. But I think where we want to start is you explaining to people unfamiliar exactly what GrowthX does, because that's going to give us a lot of context where we can dig into the rest of it, which I think in the back section is going to be a lot of spicy hot takes. But before we do that, we need to set context for your subject matter expertise so we can properly platform those hot takes. So what is GrowthX in a nutshell?
So in a nutshell, we're an early stage venture fund that was founded in the Valley that invests just about everywhere else. Not exclusive of the Valley, but we kind of don't invest there. We were founded, our experts at go-to-market, and that really has become our bat signal for founders. We have sequenced the path to product market fit, and we've done it, for a very real reason. We want to reduce the time it takes for our founders to get investment ready for Series A. And we want to make sure they hold on to as much ownership as they can along that journey. And then we started partnering with others, accelerators, tech hubs, governments, other investors, to do the same thing for their founders, give them that same unfair advantage that we give our founders. And we do it, for one reason. And that is, we want to earn the right to invest in qualified deal flow. That's what we do. So I joke it's the only form of legal insider information in North America.
Okay, so that was great because I think you hit all the keywords that currently have our listeners while they're walking their dogs being like, oh man, I got to pay attention to this episode. This isn't like when they rant about open banking for 45 minutes, which is perfect. But there's a couple of things that you mentioned there. Again, hey, a product market fit has entered the chat. I want to hold on that though, because you're talking about maybe support for ecosystems that you provide. Two things that stand out to me: Valley-based, but you're in Tennessee. But then also GrowthX is doing a lot of work with Canadian incubators and accelerators that our listeners would be very super familiar with if they're not familiar with GrowthX or the state of Tennessee, such as Alberta Innovates, Innovate Edmonton, Propel, Collabs, Platform Calgary. How the heck did you get so deeply embedded into these Canadian tech ecosystems across the country, particularly ones that, as we discussed previously, aren't seen at the level as Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal by themselves? We think they're great.
Yeah. Well, so listen, I do think it's safe to say that GrowthX has found product market fit in Canada. Let's rewind the tape back to 2015. When we founded GrowthX, the big bang that would become GrowthX is a noticing that I had traveling from my home in Palo Alto to see a company I was looking to invest in San Francisco. And it occurred to me on the Caltrain ride that day that in San Francisco, in the Valley at the time, if you know how to build products and you start a company, they call you a founder. But if you know how to sell products and you start a company, they call you a non-technical founder. And it's meant most certainly with a pejorative intent as a second-class status of human. And, when you have a noticing like that, as you guys know, I was privileged to serve as the publisher of Reuters News for many years. So I was trained by some of the best journalists in the world to pay attention, to look at facts, to draw insights, to think about things, right? When I did that after that noticing, it occurred to me that there was no Heroku of biz dev. There was no GitHub of sales. There was no Ruby on Rails of customer development. And even though I didn't have to walk more than 2 blocks in San Francisco to bump into a coding boot camp, I couldn't find a single market development boot camp. That's what became GrowthX. I tell that backstory because our 2 founding beliefs were, 1, founders shouldn't have to leave their homes to build a great company. It didn't make sense to us that founders were leaving their communities, their friends, their families, oftentimes their customers, and the relatively low cost of where they lived to uproot, move to the most expensive rat race in America just to be close to their capitalist, right? So this was before Steve Case was riding around in his bus. This was before investing in the middle was top of the Gartner hype cycle. And so how we landed in Canada was, and not just Toronto, is we love nascent startup ecosystems. It's where we're the happiest. It's where we can have the biggest impact. We believe that we can create venture type returns for our investors, but we can also help people create wealth for themselves, maybe for the first time in their family's history. We can help economies transform, like in Canada, from energy to energy plus. We can help create jobs. We can do these kinds of things all at the same time. And so even though we were all based in San Francisco and me in Palo Alto at the time, from day one, we were traveling to places like Alberta, like Cincinnati, Ohio, like Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, like Arkansas, right, like Alabama, practicing venture in a way that was very consistent with who we are and how we wanted to build up the promise of experience of GrowthX. The second core belief was that it ain't dog food until I see a dog eating it. And then it only becomes dog food, right? Nothing happens until someone sells something. We put those things together. So literally, how we landed in Canada was when I spoke at the NACO conference many years back. And listen, very much what you're going to hear today, we spoke at that conference in that the same message, and it resonated. And I think one of the reasons that we found product market fit early in Canada and still enjoy it and really, really revel in all of our relationships around Canada. And by the way, they're growing. What we're going to be doing in Canada, we're going to be announcing soon is growing, is because the message naturally resonated there relatively more than probably anywhere else. Founders that were hungry to build companies of enduring value, not just the subsidy of venture capital. Communities, and by the way, governments that believe that entrepreneurism could do those other things that we talked about if done right, where there was less interest in the theater of the demo day and more interest in the substance of going to market and doing the things that we know founders have to do. So that's a bit of a backstory, but that's literally how we landed in Canada. That NACO conference is a little bit of our Canadian big boom. I think maybe every relationship we currently have has maybe 2 or 3 degrees of separation at most to that conference.
Yeah, and that's one more from Kevin Bacon, I think. So that's not, it's not that bad.
One more, one less.
One more bacon.
I think we can agree on back bacon, by the way.
How do you define, exactly, how do you, oh gosh, what does product market fit look like for GrowthX? Like back in the day, it was the entrepreneur, I'm talking like 10 years ago, not even that long ago, the entrepreneur had no choice. You needed to your point about like what like a good entrepreneur looked like, and some of those structures continue to exist. In the Valley, it's the investors didn't want their portfolio companies to exist outside of the Valley because they believed that them being in the backyard allowed them to have some semblance of control or awareness, and then it also allowed them to sort of like the same types of humans were all commingling with the same type of thing. Obviously, that's changed over the last decade, but how do you define product market fit in this market?
Well, so wow. I mean, like, I think we could spend the
A
rest of
whole
our time
podcast.
together. No,
Well,
it's a brilliant question. Listen, product market fit for us is no different than product market fit for everybody else that's bringing something innovative to a market, right? There are 5 objective, measurable characteristics. I don't want to geek out about them. We can get that later if you want, but we're no different, right? Narrowly defined customer type and use case, customers that are satisfied and can verbalize the value they've received in a way that helps you build repeatable processes, customers that will kick and scream if you take your product away, et cetera, et cetera. There are literally 5 objective things. We define product market fit. We don't just shove the term down the throats of founders. But I want to back up to something you said and maybe just pick at it a little bit if it's okay. You said founders didn't have a choice. Let's be clear, founders always and still have a choice. Venture is only one form of capital. And if you don't know how my capital behaves and what it expects of you, how do you know you want my capital?
Okay, so we've got a VC on the podcast shouting out Alberta along with Cincinnati and Kuala Lumpur, and then talking about how venture capital is only one format. I think this is part of the reason why we want to have you on the podcast, because you're willing to shoot straight on this, but your perspective. I think everything that you've said so far directly resonates with kind of the Canadian market for 2 reasons. One, because we have been taught and told or have been fighting against the notion that, hey, we love Canadian companies. Why don't you just reincorporate in Virginia and then we'll fly over here and do that? But then also, particularly in this post-COVID moment, there's a lot of people in parts of Canada who would wish to remain there and aren't looking to relocate, and honestly aren't even willing to commute into their local office. But on that second side, the product market fit, I think there's 2 things here. You had kind of mentioned maybe Canadian companies are less reliant on venture capital to grow and succeed. I would say they've been less successful or less compelling in acquiring that, but certainly more focused on actually delivering product market fit, while at the same time, some of the ecosystems you're serving maybe less prepared in developing kind of like a framework to approach that and really attack it in a considered way. So I'm just wondering if maybe you can help connect us from your perspective, the US-Canada divide here, and maybe how you, because as Canadians, we love seeing ourselves back through your eyes. So
tell us what to do.
Yeah, tell us how you feel about us.
Yeah.
I'm not going to do that.
Now we just want even more.
Exactly.
Listen, I'm going to quote a friend and a Kauffman Fellow. I'm privileged to be a Kauffman Fellow, Alan Taylor, who runs the Endeavor Fund, who wrote a really important piece during COVID, which is about the decoupling of capital and geography that was accelerated during COVID. VCs, for the first time in the history of the asset class, storied institutions on Sand Hill Road deploying capital to founders they'd never personally spent any time with. And lo and behold, the world didn't end. But it took that kind of event. The asset class, the progenitors of the asset class are Sand Hill Road. It's steeped in that history. Thankfully, it's changing. Not because I have a problem with those storied institutions. We're building on the backs of giants. But the asset class, thankfully, is diversifying. And I mean that word large. And that's a good thing for founders. But the other thing I will say is, the first thing that I do when I teach a class in venture, or when I'm speaking with founders, or just individually being pitched by a founder who's unnecessarily nervous, is say, hold on a second, let's just stop a minute. Venture capital is an asset class. That's all it is. Let's de-romanticize it, because part of what you guys are talking about is a narrative that's leaked out of the Valley and has been accepted and internalized whole cloth by ecosystems like around Canada. Oh, but by the way, this is not something that's unique to Canada. This conversation, we could be talking about a nascent startup ecosystem in a lot of places in the world, but it's been adopted whole cloth without question, and that has impacts. But let's talk about it as an asset class, because there's nothing romantic about it. And if it's an asset class, that means all I am is a money manager. And there's definitely nothing romantic about being a money manager. Why isn't Hollywood making movies about commodities and energy traders?
Only when they go to jail.
The romance meter on the venture asset class, and oh, by the way, on entrepreneurism, is off the charts. And you'll trace it back to a narrative popularized by Main Street media and Hollywood. and certainly loved by Silicon Valley, that's leaked out of the Valley, and I would say infected places like nascent startup ecosystems around the world.
We can name them. We can talk about Atlantic Canada. We can talk about Alberta. But
I mean, it's kind of everywhere.
Well, I think
right?
to a certain extent it has, but let me put the crescendo on this, which is asset classes and making me a money manager. Okay. So now let's look at the portfolio of an investor, whether it's an institutional investor, a family office, or a high net worth individual who is investing in multiple asset classes. In what other part of their portfolio do they require everything to be a Delaware C Corp? Why is it that in the venture asset class, it has to be a Delaware C Corp and historically run by men? Why is that? If we're willing to really talk about venture and understand what it is and not just get caught up in the Hollywood version of it. And by the way, this is for founders and fellow funders. Let's talk about it for what it is, an asset class. Let's understand why it behaves in a certain way so we can help make it behave differently and broader and better and mature. Back to the point that founders didn't have a choice. Founders always have a choice. I understand that in certain ecosystems, there is a disparity and an imbalance between the supply and demand of the entrepreneur and the funder, but there's still a choice to be made. And I think it's really important that your listeners who are founders and those who seek to become savvy venture investors recognize that it is about seeking fit. We want founders to be confident in our asset class because when they're going to market to raise capital, I am their customer. And they need to treat me that way. They need to understand and have empathy for my professional objectives, lest they waste their time on someone who's not a good fit and enter into a violent relationship.
Okay, so I think all of this is a perfect example of why we wanted to have you on, because we've had a good run recently of identifying Canadian VCs who are willing to speak counter to the narrative that is generally propagated across this country, because there are been few voices, right? So what we get is the handed down wisdom from the Valley as filtered through Canadian VCs, marked down at like a 20% amount. We've had a great run of having Canadian VCs come on and speak earnestly about, one, conditions on the ground, what's truly going on with macroeconomics, what all the Tiger global deals were doing, and what maybe a lack of federal support down the road might impact, as well as the founder's desire to chase certain headlines and coverage about their company and how that might be harming them, their employees, things like that. You are going further up the stack when talking about just fundamentally the considerations here about both the willingness, desire, and the choice around venture capital, which as a bootstrapped entrepreneur myself, I'm friggin' loving. But I want to bring it back to maybe where this intersects with the other work that you do, because one of the components that we discussed when we were talking previously is like the intersection between VC funding and incubators and accelerators. And it's not just the narrative that's been adopted, it's also the methodology of growing ecosystems that's been adopted. And as we've seen in Canada, when it comes to like our most popular incubators and accelerators that are recognized are US programs that have been adopted here for the most part. You're not necessarily working with those programs. You're working much more with like local, I would say like provincial or city ecosystems, kind of deciding that they're investing in innovation locally, but they're still searching for a process to adopt and grow and support local innovation.
Yeah. I mean, the only thing I'll say quickly is in Alberta, we are working with them very proudly. We're proud to work alongside 500 startups. We're proud to work alongside Plug and Play. We're proud to work alongside The Alchemist. We're not in any way competitive. We're collaborating at the direction and the absolute intent of Alberta Innovates. This is not a coincidence, to make sure that the marketplace for founders from idea to exit is mapped out and the public resources that are being used to support entrepreneurism is a good, smooth, thoughtful baton handoff from stage to stage. I just want to call that out because that's an example where we're all together in that ecosystem.
Hopefully for the benefit of the entrepreneurs. But I just maybe want to go to a place, there's something you said to me that struck out so much so that I wrote it down so I could say it back to you. the demo day is the place where the leftovers are sold to the less savvy investors at a markup. And I think for most Canadian founders who have participated at several demo days as a point of pride or maybe the ultimate outcome, who have gone through multiple incubator accelerator programs, just bouncing back and forth, I would think that this is a bit of a shock to the core. And I'm wondering if you could help us break down the relationships between maybe the capital systems that have been functioning in the US and that maybe that Valley approach, how that's impacting the lessons that entrepreneurs are being taught, what their focus is on, and maybe where you're coming in differentiating. Because back to the keyword of the product market fit and driving that growth, we haven't really heard that a lot in the last 2 years. And now there's been that return to, oh, actually, maybe you should have a strategy that like helps you make money from customers. It seems to be so emergent and new again. And I'm just wondering how you are developing programming in that environment. Is it now like the perfect time to be going through like GrowthX programming because you've been saying this the whole time?
And listen, I think the facts support that the startup ecosystems have caught up to our approach and our brand. Let me say it differently. They are catching up. There's still a lot of innovation theater awash in the system. And I stand by it. Savvy investors know that that is what the demo day process is. The insiders have already taken. I'm a venture capitalist. I'm a money manager. My asset class is venture. I buy and sell money for a living. I buy money from limited partners in exchange for 6 things. And I sell that equity to founders in exchange for equity. The 6 things that I sell to my limited partners, my investors, is sourcing investments, selecting the companies, earning an allocation at an attractive valuation, constructing a venture portfolio, because that's my asset class, creating an unfair advantage, or some people refer to it as king making or queen making, and then, of course, returning that capital with venture returns to my LPs, right? That is an important foundation to the conversation that we're having, because the savvy investors and the insiders who have access to those companies going through the well-reputed accelerator programs are getting early access, sourcing, selecting, and doing deals at a good valuation, buy low, sell high.
Pre-demo day, separate from the graduation experience. Yeah.
It's all done already. So demo day is just a pond of fish that someone else caught and threw back.
If we zoom the camera out and go back to what you were saying, there is a narrative arc that works not only about like this sort of rarefied air that venture capitalists live in, thou shalt build a company in the garage and money will come and save you and you'll be flown down to the valley. Like that's the narrative. But then, in the last 12 years, since the advent of the accelerator, everyone and their mother has an accelerator. They're all around the world. The model seems to be, hey, that worked in the Valley. Let's just copy and paste it in the ecosystem we happen to be in, kind of blindly, right? BetaKit has a shirt, Silicon Valley North. Like it's bullshit. No, like the mistake I think other ecosystems that aren't the Valley have learned in the last 5-10 years is don't try to be Silicon Valley. Try to be you.
Not only don't try to be Silicon Valley, but there's only one Y Combinator, period. Everybody else is distant. Like, so trying to just do in your hometown what only Y Combinator has been able to do.
Exactly.
Right. And oh, by the way, even the Y Combinator demo day has lost a lot of favor. And
you mean all 300 startups that have shown up?
Hey,
given cohort?
Hey, we finally started to get like 20 Canadian startups in for cohort. And now you're going to write? No.
That's 1% of the cohort. I'm just kidding.
That's part of it too. But what's the different? What Y Combinator does that no other accelerator does, really, with few exceptions. We'll talk about few exceptions. Is they actually do inflect the opportunity for a company to be successful by the mere fact that they go through the program, separate and aside from some of the substance that they add. So, and that's a separate conversation, but you're right. It has been adopted whole cloth. And by the way, what do those accelerators do? They help founders finish their product and raise money, not market their product and make money. If you ask any accelerator operator, and trust me, we have globally hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, okay? Literally. They'll say the same thing. And same thing in Canada. What do? We help our founders become investment ready. But they've equated investment readiness to a good story pitched well.
Yes, that's exactly the point I'm driving at, which is that, I think we've learned in the last 12 or so years since the advent of the accelerator, notwithstanding YC, that the affordance of an accelerator is to pitch at a demo day. Everything else that happens in the middle, even the early accelerators didn't help you with product, go to market. They had experts. You could talk to the experts. Maybe, and these days, everyone's a quote unquote expert and certainly in this ecosystem that is relatively early in venture space. We have a hell of a lot of advisors in the ecosystem who I'm not sure if they were ever operators.
I've been a mentor for an accelerator to my great shame.
Yes, and you sold 7 companies, Douglas.
Yes.
So my question, to you, Andrew, is you're coming at the other end of it. My understanding is the value prop of GrowthX is and this is what you said at the very beginning, there's the go-to-market thing. Because now everybody can start a tech company, right? I can do it with Airtable and Notion. Being able to go to market tells you is the hard part, not actually creating the technology, which it was 12 years ago. Where are we now in the universe where everyone's got an accelerator? They're kind of undifferentiated. There's a whole bunch of talent across the world. You have to mine and get those ones ready. That's more about pattern recognition across the world because there's a lot of Bologna out there. How do you, with GrowthX, do that?
Well, again, it's one thing to know your body has DNA. It's another thing to be the person that sequenced it. We didn't invent product market fit, but we sequenced it. And by the way, expertise is not enough. And what you were talking about before, we call mentor chat roulette.
Oh, yeah. Sometimes it was more of like a mentor or firing squad at various things.
Well, and by the way, some of those mentors are very successful, highly regarded, respectful founders. But doing it yourself and teaching it are very different, and not just dropping wisdom bombs, not showing off how smart you are, but actually making the person you're talking to smarter and not just motivating. Expertise is not enough. You also have to have a platform. You have to be systematic about it. We have to be systematic about it. Our founders have to be systematic about it. So a few weeks ago, Christopher Jans from Point9 published his newest SaaS funding napkin, the 2022 version. This thing is awesome. It's a great resource for any founder. If you guys have links in your podcast page, you should definitely link to the SaaS 100%. Funding napkin. So what are some of those key takeaways? Nearly half, 46% of the investors they surveyed said that product market fit has become more important in 2022. By comparison, 26% of the investors said that revenue growth was more important. So what's the key takeaway? For SaaS founders looking to raise capital in 2022 in Canada, systematic sales activities yielding repeatable revenue results matter more to early stage investors than simply growing your revenue. So to the question of what do, we've sequenced the path to product market fit. We can tell you objectively what the 5 things are that you need to accomplish to have product market fit. We can help you take every single step towards the truth of that. And we can enable you and empower you with case studies, with examples, with exercises, with best practices. And we do it regularly because, again, it's not just our expertise. Carbon doesn't scale. We're carbon-based life forms. Silica scale. So what we can do is with our platform, which houses our expertise, our coaches and our team are spending time in the weeds of go-to-market problem solving. We're not teaching. The platform does that. And oh, by the way, when you're going to product and your product doesn't work, you know it. But when you're going to market, you have no idea whether it's working or not. There's no haptic feedback. There's no answer key.
Yeah, your pitch deck looks amazing. What's wrong?
Right. So founders require relational case studies and representative examples because that's where they build up their confidence and that's where they form conviction. And that's what the best early stage investors are investing in. Learn it all founders with conviction to something that can lead to something big in a small amount of time. And so that's what we're doing. And yeah, it's very different. Now, let me go back quickly. There is value to the demo day. I'm not saying there's no value. I am going to call it out for what it is. And if anybody wants to disagree, I'd love to have the conversation and learn.
We could book that conversation on the
Let's
podcast.
do it. I would love
sure.
it. My goal is to be less wrong tomorrow than I am today.
It's the demo day on demo days is what it's going to be. You're all going to pitch your opinions and we'll judge it.
I love it. Let's meta. I would love it. Let's do it. But like demo day does have a purpose. The narrative is important. The pitch deck is in fact way more important for the founding team than the investor. This is how you make sure that this thing you're doing is worth your valuable and important limited time on this earth.
Codifying your vision, for sure.
For most of us, we need to go from soft copy to hard copy, which is pen to paper or keys on a keyboard. One of the things that I learned very early, I started out my career, as a tech lawyer. I'm a recovering lawyer. I'm on step 5, apologizing to all my former clients. But seriously, one of the things that I learned as a corporate lawyer, when I would negotiate for 12 hours, 13 hours, 14 hours, and the client and the investment bankers would go to a fancy dinner and I got stuck back in my billing unit, otherwise known as my office, memorializing the conversation, where everybody else saw a period, I saw a comma. And that's because I had built up this muscle energy going from soft copy to hard copy. That's what a pitch deck does. It is a narrative. All a pitch deck is user interface, graphic interface on top of a narrative. It's important. And oh, by the way, like becoming comfortable and understanding how very quickly to get into the space of a VC who's investing, and it's very easy to say no and it's hard to say yes, and all those things. Like, by the way, that is really, really important. But there has to be substance. There has to be the substance. A top-down total addressable market with a lot of trailing zeros is not substance if it's not backed up with a bottom-up, data-backed view on how you're going to go to market. And to cap it off, I'd say, listen, for us, it's always been the case that customers are the best people to raise money from. They don't take equity. They don't want board seats. They just want you to help them.
Yeah, well, and again, I think part of the reason why this is probably so appealing to Canadian entrepreneurs for a bunch of different reasons we discussed, narrative or otherwise, is there's nothing Canadian founders love more than launching a SaaS business and selling to customers. It's like what we do more. So like culturally, the types of businesses that we build are B2B SaaS first before anything else, where, what if we just spent $10 billion and then everyone used our thing and then eventually we'll find a way to profit from it? It just isn't. Canadian founders just don't do that. All right, Rob, we're going to do something a little different. Normally, it's just me by myself reading some excellently crafted messaging from one of our sponsors. This is a little different. Why is that, Rob?
Well, we talked to our friends at ThinkSound, who have a pretty cool set of headphones.
Are you talking about the ThinkSound OV21s, Rob?
That is precisely the headphones I'm speaking of.
Is this a little bit of product placement on the BetaGit podcast? Our first ever product placement?
Yes, and I can hear you very clearly because I'm wearing the OV21s.
And we have been using these OV21s since we got them in a variety of different ways, but particularly on the podcast.
I mean, it sounds natural, right? It really sounds like you're talking to the person. At least when I'm listening, when we're doing our show, it feels like you're here. There's a presence to it.
Tell us how these high fidelity over-ear headphones with 45 millimeter dynamic drivers and passive noise isolation are feeling on that bald dome of yours.
I'm a big over-the-ear kind of person, and it feels good. It feels like it fits on my ears pretty well.
They're not heavy, really comfortable resting on your head, and that really matters for me as someone with horrible neck and back problems where any sort of weight on the dome, it dramatically impacts in any way. Having worn these for like hours straight, doing the podcast recording or just doing some like mixing of the podcast itself, it's just really comfy. You don't think about it, you don't worry about it. And I think for these kind of headphones, not worrying about these things being on your head is kind of like one of the best compliments you can give. The packaging is next level and really granola, which I super appreciate.
It's cool.
Even the little bag that it comes in, so that when it's in your carry-on, when you're traveling to Montreal for Startup Fest looking to do a podcast, none of the super fancy wires or the cups are getting damaged.
Yeah.
Might we suggest you head to thinksound.com.
Thinksound.com.
Check out the OV21s And hey, tell them Beta Kit sent you. Because it just sounds so good in your ears. You said a lot of things that no VC on this podcast has ever said when we've been recording. And I think one of the things that we had kind of shared with you is like part of the motivation for doing this is that there's a lot of VC voice filling up this ecosystem with a limited perspective. So we've been trying to add perspectives so they can see like how VC's bread gets buttered or what they're paying attention to and how that might impact the founder. You have the willingness and the forthrightness to just come on and lay it out. Before we talk about some of their go-to-market strategy, I want maybe just a little bit of a conversation of how they should be seeing and viewing the relationship to venture capital in the first place, or if they should be making that choice, how they navigate this. Because again, one of the things that's very interesting to me, we've been talking about developments of the last, say, 10 years. In the last 10 years, it's changed from I work at a small business to I now run a startup to, hey, I'm going to university to be an entrepreneur and I'm leaving school early, or all of my program is dedicated to the university's innovation department and they're trying to raise a fund on the side. And like, that's what the pipeline is. There's a deal flow for talent pushing them out through this. We've noted things in brief, in pinpoints of how I think we all are aligned in feeling that founders should maybe understand the relationship between this capital and stuff. But I'm wondering if you can kind of connect those dynamics between how they should be approaching this, when they should be approaching this, when that comes in this like this very early stage ideation or development process. Because right now the whole idea is that preparedness to be venture investable. And I think that now more than ever shows that it's broken. And even the VCs are saying like, yeah, we actually kind of want you to be a money-making business before we invest in you, which most businesses could be anyways without venture investment. So how are you maybe not laying out this dynamic, because that's probably beyond the scope of the programming you do, but how are you approaching it existing in this space as a VC, as an educator connected to accelerators and dealing with founders? Like those seem to be all the touch points that we keep not dancing around, but like identifying.
Well, I mean, let me first start by saying that, like, I have to be honest, like, in my experience so far, and I don't claim to have relationships with all the Canadian venture investors. I'd love to. But let me just say, so far, Canadian venture gets this. Venture investors like, Rob Barbara at Build Ventures in Atlantic, Canada, or Brian Slauko in Alberta are putting companies that they're looking closely at into our program because they know that we produce the unique investable insights that, unless you have 100 to 250 million of assets under management as a venture investor, you can't do the things that we do. They're putting their existing portfolio into our programming because we are in that way a platform as a service to them. This is not GrowthX coming into Canada hoping to take your best deals and strong arm everybody else. We exist in a big, friendly sandbox. And by the way, that means sometimes we don't even get selected. We respect that. We're looking for good fit, but we freely share the unique investable insights that we generate through helping founders with other investors. And we're doing it right now with Canadian investors, and they absolutely get it.
Well, and can I just pause there for a second? Because you're being so Canadian right here. You're being so polite. And the wonderful position
you might be the first person to accuse me of that.
Rob and I have in terms of being just like grumpy old dudes on a podcast is that we can kind of maybe speak on your behalf a bit. Like we know firsthand how bad it is in certain ecosystems when it comes to having the full spectrum of support that founders need. And we touched upon it a little bit in terms of like, hey man, the pitch preparedness and things is good, but BetaKit participates. Honestly, we work with a lot of the same organizations that you work with, because we know as our give back to the ecosystem as liberal arts majors with no other appreciable skills, the only advice or support that we can provide to founders is on, I would say a little bit of marketing, that's me personally, but on their communication strategy, because there's no support for that. It's always, they might get the technical support, they might get sometimes the sales support, founder stuff. And then comms is always this weird thing off to the side. We could probably do a series of all the core operational components to a business that do not get enough attention for early stage founders, because the people that they're learning from don't have that support or aren't interested in providing it.
The business model of venture doesn't support it.
Yes.
That's why we're innovating the business model of venture while we're substantively helping founders and earning the right to invest at a good valuation all at the same time. Because the model of venture is 2 and 20. As a venture investor, as a money manager of the venture asset class, my entire operating income, including paying myself and everybody and travel and office and finding deals and winning the deals and helping my portfolio, is 2%. So let's say you're fortunate to raise a $30 million fund. Where I grew up, 30 million is a lot of money. 30 million can do a lot of good across Canada, a lot of good, right? Especially when you're not just subsidizing unprofitable growth to get out before anybody notices. But guys, 2% times 30 million adds up to a whole bunch of who gives a shit. So founders, I'm not looking for founders to feel sorry for venture capitalists, but if you don't understand how we do what we do and why we do what we do and how we are measured in what we do so we can keep doing what we want to do, then what business do you have pitching us for our capital? It all has to happen at the same time, right? And so, yeah, okay, maybe we tend to think about it a lot more than most. I consider myself a geek of the asset class. And again, I am super blessed to be a Kauffman Fellow. I have learned so much from that program and really from the Kauffman Fellows, who I've been able to learn and benchmark, and it's extraordinary. And so I believe that, the Kauffman Fellowship is not just an asset of Andrew Goldner. It's not just an asset of GrowthX. It's an asset for anybody who wants to give me a microphone and listen. And so how can we do the things that as GPs that we need to do, which ultimately add up to returning capital to our LPs in a venture way, while focusing on the thing that the founders care the most about? Remember, I buy and sell money, so I have a buy side and a sell side. I'm just a marketplace. And so when I'm on my sell side, the founders, what's the number one thing they care about in terms of what I need to do to keep being a general partner, a venture capitalist? And that's create an unfair advantage for my portfolio companies. And the other thing I'll say, and we haven't even touched on this, and you guys know this extremely well, in the age of information, it's not just BetaKit that's a media company. Everybody is in part a media company, which means as a VC, I am also in part a publisher. What does that mean? And how can we bring it together to use this, quote, narrative capital to create that unfair advantage for our portfolio companies? And you see it done differently by different venture capitalists. Here's the thing, guys. Our thesis is the problem with the 2 and 20 model is for you to get to enough assets under management that 2% times that number gives you something meaningful to actually help people. You don't have too much assets under management to behave at the early stage of venture without creating problems in the ecosystem, like insisting on ultra high valuations that don't do anybody any good. So when the music stops like it has, founders are left without a chair. Right. So the 2 and 20 model actually creates perversity because what gets measured gets done. And so what I'm saying is it's broken because if you raise as much as you need, you now have too much to be able to be what we consider to be at the venture asset class pre-Series A aligned with your founders. When that VC says, have you considered raising more than the money you're asking for? They're not being nice. They're not being nice. You're about to start working their priorities. Congratulations. You just subjugated your priorities to that of the investor. And while you went out and had dinner and drank to celebrate, you're a dead person walking.
Okay, so this is where we're getting towards how I wanted to frame this, because I think if the net result of this was that founders started feeling sorry for VCs, I think that would be actually a hilarious outcome. It might actually be that they're maybe a little bit more wary than they naturally are, which would be a preferred. But what I want maybe you to speak to,
I want them to be comfortable
in the knowledge of knowing how to navigate. But that what that comes down to, and I think this is one of the things that we wanted to make sure we addressed on this podcast, is how do you feel that founders, what are the decision points that they should be making to decide if they want venture capital, if it's right for them, and then how to approach raising it?
Here's what I teach. Venture is synonymous with big fast. That's it. Okay. So first, by the way, again, for yourself and for your co-founders and your team and for your family? Is this the way you want to grow your company? Because I got to tell you, growing a company on earth can be super rewarding. You can create wealth for your family. You can become a respected member of community. You don't have to be a rocket to another planet. But if you are, you know how much energy it takes just to leave the Earth's atmosphere? It's uncomfortable. In fact, one of the greatest living astronauts, Canadian, Colonel Hadfield, commander of the ISS, listen to him talk literally about the actual physical sensation of trying to leave the Earth's atmosphere. That's what it is to be venture capable. Entrepreneurs are self-selecting themselves into an extremely small cohort of human beings, the people that can create something from nothing. And now you're a venture capable entrepreneur. You're now self-selecting yourself into a sub-cohort of that extremely small cohort to begin with. And what you are saying, when you raise venture capital or you attempt to raise venture capital, you are raising your hand and you are saying, on behalf of myself, my co-founders, my team, and my family, I want to go very big, very fast.
Well, let's keep it the astronaut metaphor because I love it. Shout out to Roberta Bondar from Sault Ste. Marie, my hometown. It's not very big, very fast. It's we believe we can achieve escape velocity, that we can get out of orbit, and that requires a very hard burn to
It
go.
does, but
very
it
fast.
also you got to be interested in raising capital, not just your ego. Because the first thing that Silicon Valley did is they created a second-class status of the founder by calling sales founders non-technical. And then they created a second-class status of entrepreneur for those that didn't want to go venture. They called us lifestyle entrepreneurs, as if somehow, like where I grew up in Cleveland, when my mom creates a company and builds it to 10 million of annual revenue, wealth for the family, respect in the community, right? Why is there a word for her in Silicon Valley, and that's failure? So you got to get past that. You got to wonder why it is that you're looking to raise venture as a founder when you don't literally even know what venture is. How do you really want to get big fast? I tell founders that you take my money, I'm going to poke you in the eye every day going forward. Like, do you know how uncomfortable it is to have me poking you in your eye every single day? Like, joking aside, big fast is really hard and really uncomfortable. And it's hard to do and remain a well human being, right? Wellness is important. You haven't made that decision yet. Do you not recognize what this is going to do, what this is going to impact on you and your family and your friends? Like, do you really want to do that? You better figure that out before you get crack-a-lackin' trying to raise it. But if you're going to raise it, just know it's big fast. Why? Let's go back to what it is to be a money manager in the asset class. Most vehicles are 10 years long. At the end of that, we're done. I have to have given a certain amount of capital. And by the way, it's an enormous amount of capital in a short period of time. Otherwise, I don't get to be a venture capitalist anymore. That's what I'm thinking about when I'm considering and investing in you. So if you can't help me get to that exit velocity in an extraordinarily short period of time, why are you even talking to me? I hear you. A lot of VCs don't talk this way, although I will say that more and more are. We are blessed to be a part of an ever-growing amount of emerging and differently thinking venture capitalists around the world who absolutely share our worldview. And that's all we're saying to founders is when you go to market, you're just looking for people who you can help. You're seeking fit. Right? We tell our founders every time you're thinking about using the word sales or selling, stop and replace it with help and helping. One of the first things I do when I talk with a founder and all they're doing is tell me about their product, I stop, I say, hold on a second. Douglas, let's you and I pretend that we're friends. And you come to me and you say, Andrew, if you have some time, I got a problem and I need your help. Is the first thing that I'm going to do to start talking about myself?
That's actually how I met Rob.
If I'm a normal functioning human being, right? If I'm a normal functioning human being and I don't have any kind of psychopathy, the first thing that I'm going to do is say, Douglas, absolutely. Tell me what's going on. And so when they talk to their customers, I want them to envision that their customer is a friend asking for their help. Don't just start talking about your product. You now have psychopathy. No. So the customer, so what's going on? What's the situation? And oh, by the way, now we're getting into Dr. Neil Rackham's SPIN framework. SPIN, situation. It's an acronym. And then what do? Okay, so tell me, like, what's the problem? P, problem. And then you're going to start getting into like the way it's impacting their lives. Implication, I. And you're going to ultimately, if you can help them, get to the point where they recognize that if they were able to address the problem in a way that solved the implication, that would be a needs payoff. And spin framework, right? We do this all the time as normal functioning human beings with our friends and our families. Why is it that when we put our sales hat on, we start talking like this and acting,
like the least human people on the face of the earth?
That's exactly right. And by the way, it's 100% the same thing when founders are raising capital. I am now the customer. I'll give you an example. We are industry and sector agnostic because the path to product market fit is agnostic. Now, as a founder, you guys have some amazing fintech and ag tech and energy tech. We've seen amazing founders in Canada across all those sectors, right? You're a fintech founder from Canada. Have you taken the time to first determine whether you want your investor to be fintech focused? Now, I'm agnostic, so I'm happy to invest in fintech. But you know what? Maybe that's not good enough for you as a founder. I don't want just a agnostic investor. I want someone who's like, I only do fintech. I live and breathe fintech.
Paul Desmarais. You're talking about Paul Desmarais and Power Corp.
If you haven't taken the time to first determine what's important to you, then you're going to get crack-a-lack and work in my priorities, and that is violent, otherwise known as unhealthy, unsustainable, non-long-term. And my advice to everybody with the short amount of time we have on this earth is go for relationships and not transactions. Do sustainable things. Don't act in violence to anything. And by the way, violence, it's not just physical. Every day we're doing things that are in violence that are not physical. Founders have to think that way. And I want them to be comfortable so when they come to the conversation with the venture capitalist, they have an understanding of what I do and what I'm trying to accomplish. And they're just trying to seek fit. And they build their confidence to ask me questions. Because by the way, not nearly enough founders spend time with me asking me questions. They're always generous and they allow me to dig in and they answer my questions. But wait a second. As my partner Max likes to say, a founder, that's like operating the hottest nightclub in the world. And you got to work that velvet rope. Very few people get in that door. Very few people. Why are you even allowing me to talk with you when you could have through an email or just looking at my website seen that we're industry and sector agnostic when you've decided you're only going to pitch to fintech founders?
I would say it's because podcasts like ours and other publications have furthered the narrative and created a culture where founders are there to listen, not to speak. But
no, I mean, there's so many questions that founders should be asking, and they're all important. Why? Because they're important to the founder, and that means they have to be naturally important to me. Otherwise, we're not a good fit. And I tell founders, here are these questions. You can think of them. And by the way, if you ask any funder and they won't answer them, be polite, end the meeting, and never talk to that person again. Otherwise, back to that first comment that Rob made, you are choosing. You are opting in. And that's your right to do that. But don't say that you don't have a choice.
Okay. So what are we going to talk about for hour two? No. This has been amazing, Andrew.
I'm game. Is it we're over already? Well, we haven't even dropped any wisdom on.
The last 10 minutes has been wisdom. You transition purely into, okay, so you want to...
Let's talk about go-to-market wisdom, and you can edit out all the other garbage I've said. In that stuff
we're just going to run a really long podcast, and I think people are going to appreciate it. In all seriousness, like I even the stuff at the end, because I don't speak to the listeners that often, but listeners... You have to understand the reason why we're doing this is because we know and we've experienced through our own entrepreneurial journey that some of this is tactical, some of this is process. And even just something like the spin example is a great methodology that you can adopt to give you the framing to understand, as Andrew spoke to, like very human things that you want to be doing, but sometimes you need a map to make sure, or a checklist to make sure you're following that path. Everything else is fucking psychological. When I'm talking to founders one-on-one in office hours or as a side, not as a editor-in-chief covering them, every decision that they're struggling with, every problem that they're having is because of some hang up in them. Because, particularly at the early stages, these businesses are founder-driven. So for you for us to be blending the the tactical with the psychological, I think is incredibly important, because oftentimes until the founder is ready and willing to hear and change their behaviors, it doesn't matter. Like we could literally give them the golden rule, right?
Being a founder is such a blessing. And we here living in the first world take it for granted. It's such a blessing. What is one of the primary blessings of being a founder? You get to decide not just the company you want to build, but how you want to build it and the company that you want to keep. That is your right as a founder. You have earned that by slogging, eating what I call shit sandwiches every single day. You get to do that. And what do we entrepreneurs all share? We have an abundance mindset. A scarcity mindset is very different. See, the nouns don't change, but the scarcity mindset sees a challenge. The entrepreneur sees an opportunity. So what I want to say to founders is, why are you so freely giving away one of the most important blessings of being a founder by not first determining what's important to you? This is where I quote George Costanza from Steinfeld talking about how he finds parking spaces in New York City. He goes right up to the building and looks for a spot, and then he starts working out in concentric circles. Why leave your house and assume there won't be a spot in front of the building you're going to? That's a scarcity mindset. Entrepreneurs, founders, I want them to have this abundance mindset. I want them to reverse engineer and find fit, because we investors, there's a lot more of us. And I know there are in Canada because I've talked to them.
Andrew,
right?
this is far too positive and inspiring for this podcast to end on. It's not how we roll. Fear is also an incredible motivator. I want to go back to let's close on one. Give them the one go to market kind of like thing that you know that they're not doing right now. That's going to force them to sit up. Rewind this episode back to the beginning and listen to it again from that framework, or maybe reach out to their local incubator and accelerator and sign up for some programming. Hit them with the thing, slap them in the face a little bit. Don't inspire them. That's our one request to close out the pod.
There's a common saying in the startup world that founders die of overeating and not starvation. What that saying is referring to is founders have too big of a surface area. They're trying to sell to everybody because there is no profession of sales, no being taught how to do sales, and our reference point for sales are horrible, like the retail experience or Glengarry Glen Ross, right? What I'm telling these founders, your founders, is they have to be acting counterintuitively. Yes, if you're going to raise venture, blow my mind with your total addressable market, but then immediately go to the bottom up and show me where you're going to start. And you need to disqualify most people. Every founder listening right now, I promise, if they don't have product market fit, should not be talking to more than 50 people at this time. There are no more than 50 people who are actually customers. Your ideal customer profile, ICP, it is not ideal company profile. It is ideal customer profile. And what we are talking about is reducing your surface area to something that's manageable, so you can take the limited resources you have for customer and then market development and put them to the most use. Industrial engineering terminology is traction effort delta, whereas all humans like to say the most bang for the least buck.
Yeah. Which doesn't exactly mean the lowest hanging fruit, right?
It absolutely could. Now, to be technical about it, you do want an economically rational CAC LTV. To have product market fit, your LTV to CAC ratio has to be better than 1-to-1. You could do all the other things, and if you don't have at least a 1-to-1, you don't have product market fit. Now, you may be on the path to it, but what we're saying is of all potential. Here's the example I'll quickly use for your founders. I've got a crystal ball. They can't see me. You guys can. You can see my crystal ball. I just picked it up.
Yeah, can confirm.
I'm gonna peer into this crystal ball. And if we could right now, if you open the phone lines and you took a call from a founder, I would look into that crystal ball and I would immediately say, you know what? I see exactly the type of customer in the use case that you should be selling to right now. Why? Because it's going to have the least amount of friction. You're going to get the most bang. They're going to love it. They're going to fight you if you try to take it away. You have a better than 1-to-1 LTV to CAC ratio. They're going to recognize the value and realize the value and be able to express that value in objective terms that they can share with other people. And so of all the customer types in the world right now, I'm just going to assume if I give you that insight from my crystal ball, you're going to spend 100% of your time only selling to that customer type until you've exhausted it in a reasonable way. Okay, well, we know there's no crystal ball, but the ICP is as close you're going to get to it. And it's a scientific process, and it's a framework to determine of all customers and of all use cases, based on a set of characteristics that you can discover, what is relatively more likely to lead to better results that are more sustainable, more systematic, more repeatable than relative to another customer type. Because you have limited resources for customer and market development. Get the most bang for your buck. That's how you go to market. That's how you find product market fit. But it starts with literally a velvet rope around your calendar. And you're only going to let in a few customers, even though others might want to buy. What we're going to do is we're going to put every customer type you have into 3 buckets: Mr. Right, Mr. Wrong, and Mr. Right Now. And we're going to get you to spend 100% of your limited time only on Mr. Right Now. Mr. Right, that I also call Mr. Right Later, might become a Mr. Right Now if something on their side or your side changes and now you have fit. You're going to want to be top of mind when that happens, so you put them on a nurture framework. But that doesn't mean you're spending time with them.
You're not idling outside of the perfect parking spot that is not open, hoping that
That's
somehow
exactly right.
Yeah.
And so that's it. And by the way, we have a continuum of expert resources on our website that are not just wisdom bombs. These are not just static blog posts. They actually teach you how to do that. They come with videos, they come with downloadable templates, and they also come with an invitation from us. And that is, please reach out. If you go to our website and you download our ICP video featuring my partner Max Mankey, and you then download the template and you go through that exercise, don't send us your pitch deck. Send us the template. We'll help you. We'll give you feedback. And in the process, we'll learn a lot about each other.
All right, founders, you have your marching orders. And through the lens of Seinfeld, nightclubs, and Glengarry Glen Ross, which I think appeals to our demographic. Andrew, thank you so much for doing this. We're going to definitely have to find a way to get you back on for future conversations.
You know what, guys? I am so grateful. This was a blast. And, you guys asked such great questions. We didn't even get to picking apart so many of the answers.
Oh man,
I really am grateful.
So for our listeners, we might have talked before about what we wanted to talk about, and we made a bit of a list to make sure you'd be ready to. We got to a third of the list, so there'll be future conversations.
I am so grateful to be on the show, and I mean it. We have a lot of respect for the BetaKit brand. This has been a great conversation. All you have to do is ask, and I'll definitely come back.
The BetaKit podcast is produced by BetaKit Incorporated. It's edited by Katie Lohr, and its hosts are Rob Kennedy and me, Douglas Saltis. To learn more about how you can support this podcast, head to patreon.com/BetaKit.